Okay, open up your Bibles to the book of Genesis, chapter 37. If you're using one of our journals here, page 168. We are really moving on through the book of Genesis. Page 168 in the journal, or to Genesis chapter 37. I'm going to read verses 1 through 28, a longer reading. This should be a familiar story to most of you, maybe not to all of you, but listen to this as I read along. So I'm going to read a lot of verses here. Genesis 37, starting at verse 1, and this is what it says. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told his dream to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" He said, "I am seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Long passage, Rough story, isn't it? Have you ever felt such rage and anger at someone that you honestly thought you could kill them? Don't raise your hands. This is not one of those moments, okay? But think to yourself, have you ever felt that way? Think of what it would take to feel that way, that you have such rage and anger at somebody. Somebody's hurt you or done something, and you are so angry and you are so embittered about it that you honestly could kill them. It's pretty drastic, isn't it? It's an awful thought to think that you could actually become that angry at somebody, especially maybe a family member. You know what I'm saying? Because this is all a family. This family is so dysfunctional at this point. This is a family, and they're talking about doing this to their own brother. Hopefully you've never been there. But the question is, how does that happen? How do we get to that point where we can shut down our love and our compassion and our feelings and all the bond that we share with somebody, or even to look at another person who is a creation of God and made in the image of God, and think, I could kill them? How do people get to that point?
They don't have God,
apparently. Well, this is what we're going to be looking at today, and then we're going to look at what to do about it. Now, fortunately, as we read, Joseph's brothers didn't actually end up killing him when he arrived. Otherwise, this would have been a pretty short story. Joseph shows up, they kill him, throw him in a pit, they go home and go on with life, and that is the end of the life of Joseph. Because it's important, because the remainder of our time in Genesis is really going to be the life of Joseph and the way God has used him to make a people out of this family. He is going to create, this is called birth of a nation, right? And a people for God. And God is going to use Joseph in a very powerful way to unite these brothers and their sister and all this whole family and build out of them the nation through which he would bring the promise. That's the remainder of the book of Genesis. They almost killed him. But one of his brothers had a twinge of conscience, Reuben, the oldest, the responsible one. My wife would tell you the firstborn is the responsible one, if you look at the birth order studies, and I would tell you the youngest is just the one. They're so perfect, there was no need to have any more. You know, that whole birth order thing. But Reuben is the oldest, and he had a twinge of conscience as the oldest, and he makes a plan to rescue Joseph from the other brothers, who are actually planning, not just joking, but it says conspiring to kill him. They were going to kill their brother. Reuben steps in. Good move. That's probably why they named the sandwich after him, right? He gets them to throw Joseph into an empty cistern, a pit where they store water. When we were just in Israel, we see these all over the place. That's how they kept water. And when it rained, they filled up with water, and that's what they drank out of until it dried up. And we could see from the story here that it was dried up at this point. We know it's like late summer. And they found one of these empty cisterns, and they threw him in it. And Reuben's thinking, if I can get him just to throw him in there, I'll sneak back at night, I'll get him out, and I'll run him home to Dad. Another brother, though, Judah, contrived a way to get rid of Joseph and make a little money out of it. He was shrewd. Let's not kill him. Let's do what? Sell him. Why should we waste him? We can get rid of him and make a little money. A band of Ishmaelites came by. Remember who the Ishmaelites were? Their father was Ishmael, the son of Abraham. They were Isaac's rivals. Still are to this day. The Ishmaelites came by because they were on this major trade route that Lisa and I and Gary and Doris, we spent a lot of time on this trade route that went through there, and it was really interesting to see how much that drove activity there in the land of Palestine, that highway, and that's exactly where they were. They were coming down that highway heading to Egypt to sell their wares. So they sold their own brother as a slave to these traders who were headed down to Egypt. Then they formed a joint alibi that they had to tell Jacob that they had found Joseph's special colorful coat in the wilderness and told poor old Jacob that an animal must have eaten his son. And they all agreed to this. So they didn't kill him. What they did wasn't much better. He was hauled away to a foreign country and sold to a people whose language he couldn't speak. He couldn't read their writing. He would be hauled there, we'll talk about it more next week, sold in a slave market as any other slave. It was a horrible thing to go through. He'd gone from a favorite son to a piece of property just that fast. Human trafficking is not a new thing. It happens. It's a terrible thing. I remember Lisa sharing one story with me. She got to go to a conference. She apparently goes to more conferences than I do because I keep naming these conferences she goes to. And there was a woman talking about human trafficking there who had been sold into that life of prostitution as a child by her uncle, I believe it was. It happens. This is basically what happened to Joseph. We see human trafficking is big in the news right now. We've had so many of the immigrants that were coming across the border that we have found been sold into working in factories and stuff like that right now in our day and age. But it's nothing new. This is what happened to Joseph. Judah was the one who came up with the idea. No sandwich named after him. Jacob and his sons, though, at this time, now let's look at the story and see how all this happened. How did we get to this point? How could you hate your brother enough to sell him into that kind of life? Jacob and his sons are living in the land of Canaan in the southern area near the Dead Sea, and they were living as Bedouins. You've heard the term Bedouins before, right? You see them now. You'll see them in pictures. They're always living in tents. We actually saw the Bedouins when we were just there. We're driving down the highway through this very same area, and they're not living in tents anymore. It looks just like the housing you see in Juarez and stuff, where they build up anything they can. Very poor people, just making any little subsistence they can in the desert and raising sheep and goats, and that's exactly what these guys were doing. They were not poor, but they were living as people in the desert, raising these goats, and the lifestyle for them has changed very, very little in 3,000 years. They're sheep and goat herders living in the desert. And these Bedouins, they lead their animals down paths in the desert to places where they can graze. Now, to us, we think I'm going to lead them over the hill or something like that, but what we just saw on this trip is you'll see a path going as far as from Jericho all the way to Bethlehem, this skinny little trail going all the way through just nothing but desert, and they will lead these sheep through there for miles and miles and miles to find a place to graze. And so they were living this way, and they had taken their sheep and their goats, all their herds, and they had hauled them miles and miles and miles away so that they could pasture them where there was some grass. Jacob sent all of his sons out with the sheep to do this. It's a very long journey, so they would be gone for quite some time. It wasn't just an overnighter. They were gone for days or weeks pasturing the sheep. When they came back home, though, they'd been gone for a while. As soon as they got home, I don't know what the brothers did, but Joseph had a story to tell Jacob. The brothers had apparently done something wrong, and as soon as they got back, Joseph, it tells us, gave a bad report to Jacob about what his brothers had been doing while they were away. What had they done? We have no idea. It doesn't tell us. But what it does tell us is that whatever it was, Joseph was sure to tell Jacob about it. Imagine if you were one of these brothers, and you'd been out working with your little brother all this time, and as soon as you get back, he goes up and he starts telling Dad everything you've done wrong. How would you feel about that? Some of you laugh like you've been there. And if that wasn't bad enough to make matters worse as far as how this all grew and progressed, when Joseph did this, do you know what Jacob did? When Joseph gave him a bad report, when he ratted out his brothers, he narked on them, he squealed on them, whatever you want to call it. Snitches get stitches, right? What did Jacob do? Look at verse 3. He gave him the coat of many colors, the one that we've all heard about. You know, Joseph in the Technicolor coat and all that, Donny Osmond and all that. That's the coat. He comes back and he rats out his brothers. They get in trouble. And what does he get? A coat. Now, it's not just the color of the coat that is at issue here, although you generally got a couple choices in the color of your clothing, and it depended on what color your sheep were. So you got white, black, gray. Those were pretty much the colors, and you made your clothes out of the wool from those animals, and so you got that, the color of the animal. Only royalty and high officials could afford dyed, colorful cloth. And yet he gave that to Jacob. Joseph. I'm going to mess that up. It's okay. As long as you track with me, right? Jacob gave it to Joseph. However, beyond the color, it is the type of coat that matters. We know from the original language that what it really means is that he gave him a dress coat. It means it had a long hem. It went down to your feet. And it had long sleeves that went all the way down to your wrists. It's the length of the coat that matters just as much as the colors. Do you know what the purpose of such a coat is? It means you're the boss. Because you can't work in a coat like that. You can't be down here messing with sheep and walking through their mud and all that in your pretty long coat. It means you are the one who stands back and watches everyone else work. What does it mean that Jacob did for Joseph at that point? He made him the boss. Yes. They're out in the field. We don't even know what they did. We don't know how bad it was, but he comes home and he rats them out to Dad, and Dad makes him their boss. How do you think they felt about that? What was that? It made him more mad. It's like these things just keep building and building and building to make them hate him more and more and more. They got in trouble and he got a promotion. And that had to be particularly hard for them, especially considering that they're adults. Now, usually you read these stories and you think about the flannel graph, right, that we all saw in Sunday school, and we think that these are all a bunch of young guys, but these guys already have families. They're adults. They have children. They have wives. They are on their life. They're just working in the business for Dad, right? And Joseph is 17. They're adults. He's nosing in on their business. They're getting in trouble. And now Dad takes the 17-year-old and puts him in charge. Ouch. It's not like they were 10 or 12, like when we went roller skating, because that's what we did as Baptists, right? We didn't go dancing. We went roller skating, and we went to the roller skating arena in Lansing. And as soon as we got home, my sister couldn't wait and tell Mom and Dad that Donnie spent $10 on video games at the roller skating thing. But we were kids. We get over it. I'm not bitter at all. You know. These were adults and a 17-year-old kid. There's a subtle change that happens here if you're looking carefully at the text and you're reading, and it speaks volumes to his brothers, because in verse 2 it says, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. That tells me at that time they were peers. He was with them. He was one of them. He was doing the work. Now he has been set apart from them. He is no longer one of them, and what makes it worse, he is the youngest of them. Who is typically supposed to inherit the birthright and all that? Do you remember all that as we went through Esau and stuff? The oldest. And he is the youngest, except for Benjamin, who's just a little baby and isn't really in the story yet. He'll come along later. But Jacob has taken their younger brother, set him apart, and put him over them. Now Joseph was the boss man, and they hated him for it. And we're not talking about, we talked earlier about the word hate sometimes meaning to prefer one over another, and it's not the full kind of emotional hate. Here, that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about hating someone with a passion. We are talking about vitriol. They just cannot stand him. It says they couldn't even say a nice word to him. They were the steps on the ladder to his success. Have you ever been there? You work hard at work, you put a report together, you do all this, you get everything together, you win the new project, you do something, you solve a problem, and somebody else gets the credit and somebody else gets the promotion. Hurts, doesn't it? Imagine it when it's your father who does that. This is kind of like that, but worse. It confirmed to his brothers the terrible fact that everybody probably knew, but might not have been saying out loud. There's always those underlying things, and you see it, you suspect it, but nobody's saying it out loud. But here it was, and it was confirmed. And what was that fact? Look at verse 3 again. What fact did this reveal to his brothers? Look at verse 3. Yes. That's a sad verse. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons. No parent says that out loud. We all hope we don't even feel that way, right? But here it is. They're always like, Joseph, you're the favorite. Everybody loves Joseph. Everybody loves Joseph. And Dad might as well come. You're right. It's Joseph. I love him more than you or you or you or you or you. How terrible is that? He could have used a good dose of parenting 101. You would think he would have noticed that. He would have been familiar with that, because if we remember when he was born, there was a problem with favoritism too. We don't want to have favoritism in our families, do we? But it existed. Remember, Rebekah favored Jacob, and Isaac favored who? Esau, because he was the rugged man. And so Dad always preferred Esau. Dad always preferred Esau. Now he's doing the same thing again to his sons. They want Dad's love. They want his acceptance. But what we're seeing here is it just goes directly, unapologetically to Jacob. And now it's out in the open. And now it might as well have been said with this coat. And it was made obvious with this coat. Verse 4 says, when his brothers saw, so now they know, that their father loved him more than all his brothers. It was out there. They hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. It's a bad situation. Then, as things went on, God did something really special with Joseph. Had nothing to do with anything else that had happened, but at this point in time, God chooses who he uses, and he looks at Joseph, and he's going to begin using Joseph, and he begins to use him in a prophetic manner. The prophetic gift had been passed down from generation to generation in his family. We know Abraham had it. He talked directly to God, and God told him things that were going to happen. It appears that Isaac and Rebekah both had it because they both spoke to God, and God spoke to them directly, this prophetic gift. We know Jacob had it. We saw how he saw the angels ascending and descending into heaven at Bethel when he was camping there, and he had several experiences like that. And now Joseph has the prophetic gift. On top of all of Dad's favoritism, God chooses Joseph. God began to show Joseph things that would happen in the future. Now, they came to him in dreams, and that's why we always call Joseph the what? The dreamer. And that doesn't just mean he has aspirations and he dreams of what things can be. It means God is speaking to him in dreams, and it really means the dream master. At that point, when his brothers are angry and they see him coming in the distance, and they say, let's see what will become of that dreamer. They're saying the dream master. Let's do something about this. They weren't just dreams, they were messages from God, and they were absolutely true. And one day Joseph and his brothers were out in the pasture again, far from home. Well, he was overseeing them while they were tending the sheep and were working, and he thought for some reason it would be a good idea to share one of his dreams with them. He is 17, we must remember, right? I don't think he was trying to lord it over him. Like I said, he was just 17. Maybe he wasn't even sure the dreams were true, and maybe he was using them as a sounding board. I don't know, but apparently he shared this dream with them, and he said, "Hear this dream I have dreamed." And if you notice as you're reading that, he says the word behold a lot. He's really saying, listen, listen. It says, "Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." How do you think that floated with them? "Hi, guys. What do you think this dream means?" "Funny, you're going to bow down to me. I'm trying to figure this out." You know what it meant? It meant they had one more reason to hate him all the more. And that's just what they did. You look at verse 8, and it says, his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. How much more can they hate him? You have to start wondering. Let me ask you this. Do you think it was wrong for Joseph to share the dreams with them? Do you think it was wise for Joseph to share the dreams with them? I mean, God gave him the dream. He shared it. I tend to think it probably was not wise of him to do it. There are things that God may even show you himself that you should probably just keep to yourself and keep your mouth shut. I heard a comedian speaking one time and he's in California, and he said he's a Republican. He says, when you're a Republican out here, you keep that to yourself. There's times when God will show you something you should probably just keep to yourself and let him take care of it. But he chose, being 17, to share it with the world. He was only 17. We often don't have the best judgment when we're 17, do we? I had my first church when I was 27 years old. I was young and ambitious and out to save the world. Never meaning any harm. I made some mistakes that, they're so embarrassing I won't even tell you. Don't wonder about it because I'm not going to tell you. But I was young and ambitious and just out there to save the world, And it's kind of like Pastor Chuck said last week. He said, if you were listening, he said, I was ordained when I was 21. He said, you could ask me any question you wanted when I was 21, and I had the answer. He's like, now I know there's a lot of things I don't know. And that is so true. And that is where I was at that age. That's where Joseph is at that age. We are young and on fire. I did some good too, but that was probably more in spite of my youth and exuberance than because of it. Same with Joseph. With time, God knocks some of the sharp edges off us, doesn't he? And you don't want a pastor that is so beaten down that he won't rise to anything, but maybe one who's been tenderized a bit and maybe even marinated a bit so he's not quite as chewy. Believe me, Joseph will spend his time in the marinade. That's what we're going to see. But right now he is a 17-year-old boy with a man's job and the gift of God, and he probably doesn't fully realize what he's doing. He tells his father about the dream as well. If you look at verses 9 and 10, it says, "Then he dreamed another dream, and he told his brothers and said, 'Behold, I have dreamed another dream.' I'm sure they were thrilled. 'Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me.' But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?' This, of course, made his brothers do what? Hate him even more. You could just wash, rinse, repeat. Every time something happens, they hate him more. Jacob, though, of course, though, being a good and mature man, responds differently to them. Number one, he did some good things here. He rebuked him. Kind of like, keep that to yourself, right? Why is that good? Well, because Joseph needed to learn to tap the brakes a little bit. Yes, God was giving him messages, but Joseph was lacking a certain maturity as to how to deal with those messages. Joseph still needed to respect his father too, didn't he? Does that go away just because you're gifted? Does that go away just because God gives you abilities? No, there is always respect to be had. And so he is teaching him this as he's doing this. Even though God was giving him this gift, he still needed to respect them. And it was good that his dad said something to him. Proverbs 27 verse 6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Profuse are the kisses of an enemy." Sometimes you have a friend or a family member who has to say something to you that hurts, right? And sometimes it's just what you needed. But you can find all kinds of people to flatter you and to talk to you and tell you how wonderful you are, and you start believing your own press. Well, Jacob here, I think, acting as a true father, kind of helped him realize, don't always believe your own press. The second thing I like that he did here is it says his father kept the saying in mind. The brothers hated him. Jacob kept it in his heart. He just decided to keep his mouth shut and to think about it for a while. That is a sign of maturity. Not always to act on everything you hear, not always to say everything you think. It reminds me of what it says about Mary in Luke chapter 2, after the shepherds and the angels and everyone had their say about the birth of Jesus. I like what Luke writes here. He says, "But Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart." It's a good thing to do. In all reality, that is exactly what Joseph should have done with these dreams in the first place. God could have still worked his plan out with Joseph, sharing it without him sharing it with everyone, but he didn't keep it to himself. So Joseph's brothers were finally taking care of the flocks again, and Jacob sent Joseph out to check on them. The brothers weren't exactly where they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be in Shechem. They had moved on to Dothan, another 15 miles away. We don't know why, but they did. And they saw Jacob coming, and I'm sure they thought, great, this is going to be another shining report. Joseph, thank you. I'm just going to have to tag team and let her come up because I keep saying Jacob. Anyway, they'd had enough. They saw Joseph coming up the road, and they were done. Verses 18 through 20 says, "They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him." They weren't just joking about killing him, they were actually plotting. They despised him, and they despised the prophetic gift in him, and they wanted to kill him. Here's the question that raises. What does it take for someone to be so embittered against someone else that they would honestly, seriously conspire to murder that person, especially a brother? And you think of the cruelty of their actions. Later on, we'll come to the point where the brothers are coming around and just deserts are coming around, and they will say, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the distress of his soul, and when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon them." And Reuben speaks up and says, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy?" But they describes the distress in his eyes and his tears as they were selling him off as a slave, and he's saying, "No, please don't." There was cruelty in their actions. And think how it would just kill their father. Consider how much pain and suffering their actions would cause him. Jacob. He'd already lost Rachel. I'm sure that's largely why he favored Joseph so much, because Joseph was the son of Rachel, and now Rachel had died giving birth to Benjamin. And she was gone, and he was all that Jacob had to remember of Rachel was Joseph. And now they were going to come home and tell him, here's his coat, Dad, we found it. It's covered in blood. Something happened to Joseph. But at this point, they didn't care anymore. They just hated Joseph. They'll realize later when they are faced with hurting Jacob again, but at this point, all they can see is their own hate, and they don't care about anything else but taking the sting away. They have hated Joseph for years, and they're conspiring to murder him, and lie to their father about it. Thank goodness Reuben stopped them. When hate is allowed to grow, or is even fostered or nurtured, it grows into bitterness. And bitterness can lead to almost anything in any of us. That is why the Bible warns us so clearly about bitterness and letting it get into our hearts. Hebrews 12:15 warns us, and we're not going to turn there, but you can mark that down if you want. Hebrews 12:15 warns us about letting a root of bitterness spring up in our life. Something that will trip us up and is hard to deal with. You're hiking, you're walking, or you're mountain biking, and the roots across the path are such a problem. You're digging and you're hitting roots, and it's such a problem. And the writer of the Hebrews warns about letting a root of bitterness spring up in our life. We just, we're in the process of putting this gravel patio in our backyard, and there used to be a cherry tree, a beautiful cherry tree when we bought the place 10 years ago that was in the backyard, but we had to have it removed because the trunk had split, and it was like falling toward the house. So we had to have this thing removed, and they even came in and they ground the stump, and they did all this stuff. But even today, while we were digging, and you would look at the yard, and you would never know there was a tree there. There's just grass, and it's all green, and everything looks great on the surface. But as we started to dig, we found root after root after root left from that cherry tree. Got to one point, I was like, Lisa, I need to get a chainsaw to get through this one. It was such a giant root, and it was right where we needed to be. Roots are a problem. And they hold on for a long time. The tree's been gone for almost 10 years, and the roots are still a problem. Do you see what the root of bitterness can do in our lives? Acts 8, verse 23 mentions a gall of bitterness. Gall was what they tried to give Jesus when he was hanging on the cross to kind of stupefy him. It's a poison that they would use to stupefy you. And it sounds ironic that they would want to relieve the pain a little bit while you were hanging on a cross, doesn't it? But the Romans were experts at torture, and oddly, they would use the gall to partially numb the pain and extend the suffering so you could hang on the cross longer. We don't want you to die yet. We're not done yet. In Acts 23, it mentions a gall of bitterness. The gall of bitterness can do that in our lives. It can kind of stupefy our senses and our feelings. We hold on to our hurts and our reasons for being bitter. We treat our reasons like pets, and we care for them. And my hurts, and I just want to take, this is my hurt, and you can't take it from me. And I nurse it, and it grows. And we think it's actually making us feel better, but in the end, we are only extending our own suffering by allowing the gall of bitterness in our life. Joseph's brothers did this as they clung to and rehearsed the things that Joseph had done to them and what he was, what he had become. Some of the things were his own doing. They were just youthful things. He's a really, really good guy. When you stack up people in the Bible, you stack up Joseph next to anybody, and I don't know if anybody else compares. But he was young, so some of the things he had contributed to, some were not. They didn't care. They nursed their hurt, and they made it strong, and now they were plotting to kill him, and that's the way that bitterness can lead. Romans 3:14 compares bitterness to the venom in a snake's mouth. It says, their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Doesn't that sound like Joseph's brothers as he came walking up the road and they said, "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits"? Let's see what becomes of this dreamer. This venom was in their mouths. John warns us in his letter, not in the gospel, but in 1 John 3:15, he says, "Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him." That's not to say there is no difference between thinking about a thing like that and actually doing it. There's a big line you cross when you think about doing something to someone and when you do it. But it often leads to it if you don't nip it in the bud. Like Deputy Fife, nip it, nip it. You got to nip it in the bud. Or it can lead to these things. It's a warning as to where it can lead. It's like that root that just grows, a root that can break up a sidewalk or ruin a street or ruin your plumbing in your house, right? Roots do all these things. If it is not cut off, it will find a way into your life and into your heart, and it will ruin everything. We cannot let bitterness set in. And you know what? We're the only ones in our own lives who can stop it. It will poison and ruin our lives and the lives of those we love, or at least those we should love. Turn with me over to Ephesians 4, just a little bit more here, because in Ephesians 4, Paul deals with this bitterness a lot. We can't just talk about how bad it is without actually talking about what to do about it. And you're going to keep your finger in Ephesians 4, because we're going to be there for a little bit, because Paul deals with bitterness and how to deal with it a lot in Ephesians 4. And if you look at Ephesians 4, verse 31, as you're turning there, Paul says this about bitterness. He says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away with you, along with all malice." Those are all like synonyms for the word bitterness. It contains all those things: wrath, anger, clamor, slander, and malice. Do we see all those things in Joseph's brothers? But how do we do that? How do we put those away? How do we get rid of that? Well, we're going to see a progression that happens in the lives of Joseph and his brothers as we go through his life. As we finish out the book of Genesis, we're going to see a progression of how God works in him. Just like we saw in Abraham, we saw a progression to him becoming the man he was. We're going to see a progression in the life of Joseph where God deals with these things and how bitterness does not rise up in his life, but does in his brothers, and the result it has on them. We won't read all the stories. In fact, we won't read the ones about his brothers because they're pretty sordid stories. And while he was away as a slave in Egypt, his brothers were a mess. And a lot of it has to do with this bitterness in their souls. Their lives are ruined by bitterness toward Joseph. And getting rid of Joseph did not alleviate the problem. Joseph, on the other hand, will manage to relinquish all his bitterness in an amazing way. And we get to see his example of how he moves forward like this. Like I said, if there was ever anyone in the Bible with the right to be bitter because of what someone else did to them, it was Joseph. But somehow he manages to put that all aside. Just like the verse in Ephesians said, put it aside, get rid of it, set it aside, and move on with your life. There will come a day of reckoning and a day when the dreams he shared would come true. But to get to that point, Joseph had to move forward with God instead of moving backward with bitterness. And he made the right choice. 4 things we can do to alleviate bitterness. I'm going to move quickly here, running out of time. Number 1, look for what God is doing in your life through what happened. What is God doing in your life through what happened? Hindsight is 20/20. Joseph won't be able to see God's plan and what he is actually doing in all of these things he goes through for many years. But God is using all these circumstances, even his brother's malice toward him, to preserve a people for himself that the promise would come through. Understanding that helps us. Joseph would be able to look back years and years later and say these amazing words to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter. As for you, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for what? Good. Is that not amazing? Because he could see what God had been doing. Now I want to give you this caution with this. Don't overuse this or make it the first thing you bring to someone else who is suffering. I'm talking about you. You look for what God is doing in your suffering, but it can be a very harmful thing to go up to somebody who is suffering and saying, well, this is what God's doing in your life. I'm sure God has a plan. A lot of people have been hurt by that. And it may even be true, just like Joseph telling his brothers about the dreams, but is it helpful? I've seen many people hurt by well-intentioned people throwing around that kind of theology. Use it sparingly. Use it sparingly, even if it's true. I knew an old farmer. He was a funny old guy, and I can't verify if this story is true because there's so many stories about this old farmer, but they're all pretty funny. And he had a calf that got pneumonia, and the vet told him, give him 2 tablespoons of whiskey. And he gave the calf 2 tablespoons of whiskey, and all of a sudden the calf was up around, feeling good. The whiskey made it frisky, and this calf is just hopping around, and then the calf got sick again, and this farmer thought, well, if 2 tablespoons was good, just think what more will do. Killed it. It's true with many things that something in moderation can be good, but, we can overuse something and hurt a lot of people. In that very passage where Paul told us to let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away, he first gives us this advice in verse 29. He says, let no corrupt talk come out of your mouths, but only such as, and this is the important part, but only such as is good for the building up as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Amen. Season what you tell people. But when it comes to yourself, be looking for what God is doing. Number 2, that can help us. Look at what you have done to help contribute to the situation. As I said, Joseph was a great guy, but there were some missteps on his part, weren't there? Can't that help him understand how his brothers feel? It's good to admit it's very rarely a one-way street when somebody is hurt. It's usually both of us doing something and contributing to it. We need to acknowledge our part in contributing to what has happened, and that will help us with the next phase, which is probably the hardest one. Number 3 is do what God did. Look down at Ephesians 4:32. Look at verse 32. On the heels of Paul telling us to let all the bitterness and stuff be put away from you, he says this. This is one of the hardest verses, I believe, to live out in the Bible. And he says, be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ what? So I am to forgive you the same way God forgave me in Christ? Easy to say, harder to do. Exactly. I said it's almost never a one-way street in these situations. Well, with God and with Jesus it was. We were 100% at fault. He did not have to forgive us. He did not have to go to the cross, but he did. And now he says, you forgive each other the same way. The only way we can do that is by the power of God. And finally, the last point here to help us with this, we're going to see this in Joseph's life. Do the right thing, no matter what the circumstances are. Always do the right thing. That shaped Joseph's life. Your hurt is not a license for you to give allowances to your own fleshly desires and blame it on someone else. And I see it all the time. I won't say I'm not tempted to. Hey, this person did this to me, so I'm going to do this, right? We think it gives us license because we've been hurt, and it doesn't. There will be no excuses before the judgment seat of God. But God, they did this to me, and they did this to me. It doesn't matter. My son did this for you. These kinds of allowances will only increase the hurt, like drinking gall that we talked about earlier. At one point, you know that cherry tree in our backyard? This is hard to really conceive. With all the roots and all the things we had to deal with at one point, it was just a seed, a pit inside a cherry, and I don't even know how it got to that spot. And it grew into a giant tree with being nurtured and watered and fed and cared for, and then it grew these roots that we are still dealing with 10 years after the tree is gone. A little offense in your life can be the same thing. A big offense can be the same thing. Back to Ephesians 1 last time, Paul tells us more. He says, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger and give no opportunity to the devil. Many people read this and they're saying, Paul says it's okay to be angry. Well, he's not saying it's okay to be angry. It's just understanding the fact there are times you're going to be angry, because he tells us a couple verses later, put all this stuff away. And here he's just saying, what he's saying is deal with it quickly. Get over your anger quickly. Get over the hurts quickly so that cherry pit does not grow into a tree filling your backyard with roots. When he says opportunity there, it's a stronghold, a place for Satan to hold on, a place for you and Satan to agree that he has a right to be there. That's bitterness. That's what Joseph's brothers did. Have you been hurt? Do you have things to let go of, things to forgive? Is bitterness ruining your life? Give it to the Lord now and get free of it. Just give it to him and get free. Those roots are hurting you. You get the axe and you lay the axe to the root of the tree and you get free. Don't let the hurts of the past and the roots of bitterness define the rest of your life. Think of what would have happened to Joseph if he had done that. Think of what would have come of the promise of God if he had done that. If you need help doing that, I am happy to pray with you. Other people are too. But get help. If you're really having trouble getting free of something, get help and get free.